Welcome to part 10 of Making It Look Great 6. In this section we're going to add a material to our globe so that when we reach the end of the animation, at this point here, we've wiped off the soccer ball and at the moment it is just a blue sphere. I thought it would be quite prudent to add kind of longitude and latitude lines, which is pretty symbolic of a news program. So we're going to have a look at a technique to do that first of all. And the way that we're going to do that is we're just going to use a material and an alpha, and on that material we're going to generate a grid, and then we can apply that to a sphere and have it in the same place as the blue sphere. I think I'll probably use a separate object just so that we can have a slight gap between the two objects rather than apply the material directly to the sphere that's in the scene already. Let's add a sphere into the scene. If we fold down the null sphere, we can drag this into the same level of the hierarchy. Let's select the sphere, set the radius to 440. If we come to the coordinates tab and zero out the bank, so this is at the same orientation as our globe and soccer ball, etc. Next, to create the material, if we come to the material manager, I'm going to dupe the orange Fresnel material that we already have by holding Control and dragging. Let's call this globe tiles. And in the attributes manager, let's enable the alpha channel. Switch to the alpha channel. I'll just pull this up so we can see what we're doing a little bit more clearly. In the texture slot, choose surfaces tiles. So the tile shader ships with Cinema 4D, and as you can see we use it to generate tiles of different types. We're using it in the alpha channel, so the best thing to do would be to use pure black and white. But obviously it has many other uses. If you click on the pattern pop-up list, you can see that we have quite a few options in here. So you could choose hexagons or circles, etc., etc. And you can use this to create many different types of tiles or patterns. In our example, we're going to use squares. If we just pull this down and let's just find our sphere, there it is, and we can then drag the material onto the object. Okay, if we choose render active object, you can see the result currently. Let's come back into the tile shader and let's adjust a few of the settings in here. Okay, for the grout color I'm going to choose a pure white, and for the rest I'm going to use black, like so. I'm going to set the grout width to 2.5 and the bevel width to 5%, just so that we have a much finer grid. If we render the active object again, you can see the result so far. If we select the actual null sphere above, let's render the active object, and we can see it with the blue sphere in place too. Okay, so you can see we're kind of getting the result we're after already. Let's switch back to the tile shader and let's just adjust the scale. If we adjust the scale on U to be 50, and you can see now that it's just made the grid slightly tighter around the sphere. You may notice that the result is slightly jagged, but not to worry, because when we render the final output we will be enabling best anti-aliasing. This is necessary because we're also using reflection, and the reflections will be slightly jagged as well without best anti-aliasing. We can switch that on now by coming into render settings, choosing anti-aliasing, and switch it from geometry to best. If we come back now, let's just render the scene to have a look at the result, and you can see that our grid is now much smoother. It will take slightly longer to render, but if you are using transparency, alphas or reflection, then it's pretty much a necessity to use best anti-aliasing. You can always use the compositing tag, and you can actually adjust the anti-aliasing on a per object basis using that. So if you have particularly tricky objects that require higher or lower settings, then you can kind of control that object by object. Okay, so at the moment we have this grid on our globe, which is great, but we don't want this to be here at this point in time. because we have our soccer ball texture and earlier on the globe texture. So what we need to do is we need to kind of wipe this on. Now there's a few ways we could do this. We could kind of render separate passes and kind of add this on in post, which might give us a little bit more control. I'm going to show you a method to do this within Cinema 4D. And what we want to do is, as our soccer ball wipes off, to animate the visibility of the kind of tile shader. So if we come to the timeline, let's just move down in time. So we want to be at the point in time which is somewhere around here. Let's just nudge through. So at this point, this is where our soccer ball texture wipes off. So we could use that as our starting point to wipe the globe kind of material on. Now there are a few ways to do this. One method is to use a display tag, which we have on our clone sphere to clone onto, and in here we have a visibility checkbox, and you can actually animate this parameter. I'm going to show you a way of doing it within the material. So let's switch to our material manager and select our material again. If we come to the alpha tab, here we have our tile shader. Because it's in the alpha channel, what we can essentially do is we can add in another color on top and just kind of adjust the opacity of that. And the way to do that would be to use the layer shader. So if we, as we already have a shader in the slot here, what we can do is we can select the layer shader, and it will take this tile shader and it would automatically add it into our layer shader. So if I just select this, when I click on here now, you can see that the tile shader has been added in. Okay, there is a bit of a gotcha here. If you notice that now our alpha channel isn't working, this is because it's in the layer shader, and the layer shader can be made of several images. So what you have to do is just uncheck image alpha, and when you do that, we get the result that we're after. So let's come back into the layer shader, and what I want to do is just add in a color shader. So click shader and choose color. Let's click on here and just make it black, and the color shader does exactly what it says. It just creates a color. Okay, and you can see that by having a black color, we have a fully black alpha, and if you look in the material manager, our material has disappeared. If we render active object, okay, we can see something happening here. So we've got a problem already, but you can see that our orange lines have disappeared. So what's this part that's showing up here? Okay, well this will be our sky object. If I just hide the sky object from rendering and now render active object, we can't see anything. So we need to hide this sky object. If we click on the compositing tag for this object, we have an option here, seen by transparency. If we uncheck that, make sure our sphere is selected, and now choose render active object, it's totally disappeared. So what we've done there is we've selected the composite tag on the sky object and just switched off seen by transparency. Now if you did have some transparent objects and you wanted to see that through and others you didn't, you do have an exclusion tab on the composite tag. So you can either add this to your sky object or to any other objects, and you can use that to include or exclude specific items from reflecting or seeing them through transparency. In this situation we don't need to do that, so we can just leave it as it is. So let's come back to our material, open up the layer shader. So what we essentially need to do is animate this color shader so that the actual opacity of it changes over time, just like I'm doing now, and you can see that it basically will fade up the tiles. Cool stuff. So we don't actually have a option here to keyframe this parameter, so what can we do? Well, there's one way of doing it. We can click up here and we can keyframe, and this will keyframe all our layers simultaneously. So in this example that's going to work perfectly fine. So we can set a key at this point in time, move forward to where the globe is in its position at the back of the screen, reduce our layer visibility or opacity down to 0, and add another key. If however you have several objects or several layers in your layer shader and you wish to keyframe them individually, you can also do that, but what you need to do is you need to right click, I think actually you do it here, yeah, and then you just close show subchannels. And now down here you can see we have the option to key individual layers. Okay, I'm going to make it simple in this example and switch that off because I don't need to use that, but I just thought I'd point that out. So if you do have several layers in your layer shader and you want to animate them individually, just remember to click on the layers and show subchannels. So let's switch to the timeline so we can make sure we're in the right point. Let's add a key here by control clicking, and now let's drag through. I'm going to actually step through by pressing G, frame by frame. At this point in time, the camera's pulled back, the globe is in the final kind of resting position, so we can take our layer opacity down to 0 and add a key here. Let's just render to see that it's worked, and let's jump to kind of halfway between. Maybe a couple of frames later, if we look at the preview in here, we can see the level, that will do, we can see the level of opacity, so we're at 50% there. So let's render now. And you can see that our kind of tiles shader is just starting to show up. And if we come back a few frames and let's just render, and here you can see it's kind of nearly invisible. So the transition for that shader is working perfectly well. As that zooms back, the tiles shader will fade up. Cool stuff. Now I think it's time to get the scene ready for final output. And before we do that, I'm going to add some tags to a few objects so that we can use them when we're in After Effects to help us with our composite. And what I'd like to do is first of all set up some object buffers. Now an object buffer is a way of isolating an object. What it essentially does is it saves out a grayscale image that corresponds to where your object is, and you can then use this as a track matte in After Effects. If that's all Greek to you, don't worry, it should all become clear by the end of the tutorial. But what we need to do is we need to decide which objects we would like to kind of isolate so that we can add effects to them later. So for instance, I'd like to possibly isolate the text and the lines and the kind of glowy blocks, just so that we can add glows and blurs, etc. To assign an object buffer, you use the compositing tag. And what we need to do is to go through the object manager and decide which objects we'd like to group together. You can assign the same object buffer to several objects and they'll all be kind of grouped in the same matte file that's generated. So you just need to have a think about which objects in your scene you'd like to group together, and then it will save you a little bit later down the line. You could always add a separate object buffer to each object, but that could just end up with lots and lots of files that you have to deal with, and then you probably need to combine those mattes once you're in After Effects anyway, so it's a good idea to think about it now. So if you remember, we added these traced lines that whiz across the scene from left to right as the text kind of wipes on. So I'd like to keep those separate so we can add a glow to them. So that's these sweep objects here. So if we just select all three of those and choose tags, Cinema 4D tags, compositing, and we switch to the object buffer, and as you can see, we have 12 slots here because you can assign these objects to more than one buffer if you like, but we're just going to enable buffer 1, and that sets that up for those objects. The next thing that I'd like to add a buffer for is the text. So here we have the Fracture News Today object, and I'm just going to select one of these compositing tags, control drag down to Fracture News Today. If we come to the object buffer tab, let's switch off buffer 1 and enable buffer 2. Okay, and also I'd like to do the same for latest sports and top stories. As all the text appears at different times, we can use the same object buffer or matte for all of the text. So let's assign all these words to object buffer 2, and the easiest way to do that is to take the tag we've already created, and we can just control drag this down onto each of our Fracture objects. We could always group them in a null and just actually add one tag to the null, but I don't really want to start messing around with the hierarchy at this point. Now, if you're not really sure which objects are going to need buffers, it's probably a good idea to add as many as you like, and it's easy to not use them than it is to kind of recreate them, because if you need to create a buffer and you haven't added the tag to the object, then basically you need to re-render. So it's probably a good idea to just add them as much as you like, and it won't take up any more render time. It will fill up more space on your hard disk, but if when you get into the composite you don't need any, then just don't use them. Simple as that. When you add the tag to create an object buffer, it will include all the objects that are in the hierarchy. So if I want to include all these cloner blocks, I can control drag a composite tag onto the parent cloner here. Let's just make sure we remember to change the buffer number, because we don't want that to be combined with the text. I'd also like the sphere to clone onto to have its own buffer. So let's control drag this down onto that object. And again, we have the cloner as a child, so any kind of small cylinders that are sticking out in the shape will all be included. Again, we need to change the number, so let's set this to buffer 4. I think that's all the objects that we'd like to have a buffer for. Oh, actually, we have the sphere that we've just added with the kind of grid texture on it. We may well need that as a buffer too. I'm not sure about that. Let's just drag that onto there just in case, and we can always just not use it, as I said before. And I've set that to be buffer 5. And if, for instance, we want to combine this sphere with the sphere to clone onto in our mat, we can just take both those buffers in After Effects and combine them just using the add mode. Cool stuff. So I think that's all the object buffers set up for now. The next thing that I'd like to do is add what's called the external compositing tag. Now, Cinema 4D has a great multipass rendering, and it also has the option to export After Effects compositing file, and we will be using that. And what it essentially does is it outputs the camera data and also any light information from your scene. But the other thing you can do is you can also add tags to specific objects, and it will then create a null object for you in After Effects, and that null object can be used with effects and stuff like that. So you can actually add extra effects in After Effects with ease in the 3D space, and all the coordinates, etc., will all match up with objects that you have in your scene. Okay, so with that in mind, if we come to the top of the Object Manager and fold down this trace null that we created, if you remember, we used these to kind of trace lines along here, and that created these splines for these sweep objects. And what I'd like to do is just take the data for the position of these nulls so that we have that in After Effects, and we can use that to add in some extra kind of effects. So select all of the trace null objects, choose tags, Cinema 4D tags, and just add the external compositing tag. The external compositing tag doesn't have any settings or anything like that. It's just there purely to tell Cinema 4D that I'd like to export the data from these objects, please. And by adding that to these objects, when we open it in After Effects, we will have some null objects with the corresponding name. Okay, I think we're done with adding tags in the Object Manager, so now we can configure our render settings. You can access this through the Render menu, Render Settings, or Command B. Or I have it tabbed in my layout, so I can just switch to it here. Okay, so we're using the built-in preset for PAL D1 widescreen square pixels, which is 1024 by 576. If you're using CS4, you'll probably know that it's actually slightly an inaccurate resolution. You should really be using 1050 if you're going to broadcast, but this is a whole different story. We won't go into that for this tutorial. Let's just stick with what we've got. There's plenty of resources on the internet that can explain that to you. It's just a kind of resolution that's been used slightly incorrectly for years by most applications, and to be honest, I don't really think it's something that we need to worry about for this tutorial. Okay, we've got our frame rate of 25, frame range, all frames. We're not rendering to fields, so we can leave that to none. Switch to the Save tab. Let's just pull the interface over slightly where you can see the full width of our save path. So you can click on this button here. This will then prompt you for a path in which to save your render. In this example, we're not actually going to use this because we're going to use multipass, but we will like to check a couple of attributes in here. And first of all, we're going to enable alpha, and then let's enable straight alpha. If we fold this down here, this is where we have the option to save a compositing project file. So let's check save, and the target application is After Effects. As you can see, we have the option to save this for a few different applications. There are some limitations depending on which application you're outputting for. After Effects, I believe, has the most options. Let's include 3D data so that when we import this into After Effects, it includes our cameras and the null objects here that we've added our external compositing tag to. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to do is enable multipass rendering, and what this does is it allows us to output different attributes of our render as different passes. We're going to use this specifically for outputting the object buffer. And we're also going to use it to output a couple of other passes, such as the reflection and things like that. I'm not sure if we will use them, but we could always not use them, and it will save re-rendering in case we did want them. What you can do then is you can kind of blur your reflection, and you can use it to add extra effects. You could output maybe your shadow pass if you wanted to lower the shadows, things like that. Multi-pass is a very powerful feature which basically breaks your render down into all the components that are made for it. When you save the external compositing file, this is brought into After Effects, and all the layers are kind of set up for you with the correct composite mode. And it just gives you a little bit more power in post, so that if you want to reduce the opacity of your shadow, for instance, it's very easy to do. If you want to change the color of something, it's much easier. It just saves re-rendering and gives you a lot more power in post. Anyway, we'll have a look at that when we're in After Effects. For now, let's just add some more settings. To add the multi-pass renders that you'd like, you can come down here and click on the multi-pass button, and it pops up with a list, and as you can see, there are a lot of passes that we can add. The first thing I'm going to add is the RGBA image, so that's red, green, blue and alpha, and that's the fully composited render. So even if we don't use any of our multipass, we have our RGB alpha image to work with. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose Object Buffer. And when we choose Object Buffer, you can see over here we have the option to set the group ID. So if you remember, we set object buffers from 1 to 5, so that's Object Buffer 1. Let's choose Object Buffer again, and this time switch it to number 2. So if you switch between the two, you can see that we're going to output separate buffers. Again, we need to add another one. Set this to 3, and again to 4, and lastly one for 5. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is just add in a few of the render passes, and I think for this we will use the diffuse. We'll also use the reflection, and finally the ambient. Now the ambient will include our luminance materials, which is why I'm adding this. Obviously reflection is going to include our reflections, and the diffuse is the basic diffuse color from our materials. If we select anti-aliasing, we've already set this to best. We can leave the rest at defaults for now. And options in here, we can change quite a few other settings. We don't really need to go into that now. So I think we're ready to go. If we click on the multipass tab, the save tab, and come down to multipass here. Format, I'm going to output to QuickTime Movie. That's just off the bottom of the list here. If you're on Windows, you may want to output to AVI or a different format, but I pretty much always use QuickTime. I'm going to leave it at 8-bit for this example. And the next thing I'm going to do is just to click on this button here and set a path to save all my renders. So choose an appropriate directory on your hard drive. I've put mine in the Making It Look Great 06 3D renders folder. And also check this item, a layer name, as suffix. And what that means, because we're rendering multipass, is it will add the multipass name after the title we've created. So we'll have News Today Reflection, News Today Diffuse, and that will just tell us which render is which. Cool stuff. Now before you render, it's probably a good idea to save, so I'm just going to choose Save Incremental. And if you're not 100% sure whether you set your project up correctly or not, it might be a good idea to do a test render. Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. If you want to just see the kind of motion of all your objects, you can switch to the General tab, and in here, rather than choosing Full Render, you can choose either Software Preview or Hardware Preview. Now Software Preview will render as the editor view, and it will render it without using your graphics card. If you, however, have a reasonably good graphics card, you can choose Hardware Preview. When we come down here to Hardware Preview, we can enable OpenGL, and we can also have things like transparency, shadow, post effects, noises, and also anti-aliasing. The capabilities of your graphics card will vary from computer to computer, so I can't really give you any more advice than that. I mean, by all means, try the settings, and which ones work and which ones don't, you can find out for yourself. Okay, I'm not actually going to output a hardware or a software preview, but Just bear in mind, if you do that, it won't render your materials or lights or anything like that. It will just give you a render which looks the same as it does in the editor. But it'd be a very quick render, and that's a great way to kind of analyze and check your animation. And if you're not happy with anything, you can come back, tweak it, output again. It will be vastly faster than doing a full render. If, however, you know that you're happy with your animation, or you just want to give it a go anyway, choose the full render option. If you'd like to perhaps check your lighting and materials before you commit yourself to the 100% full render, you can always come in, switch anti-aliasing to none, come to the output tab and perhaps choose a smaller resolution, render that out. If it all looks okay, then come back and set it up to the full res, and then you're good to go. These little things are pretty handy to do if you're in a production environment and you want to check renders fast. It's much quicker to output a kind of hardware preview or a small non-anti-aliased render to check things before you really commit yourself to your final render, because some of these renders can take a considerable amount of time. Okay, I think that's all good. So the next thing to do is to come up here and choose Render to Picture Viewer. At this point, I'm going to add in a small change to the tutorial. This is pretty typical of a production environment. What will happen is you think, okay, I've finished the scene, brilliant, I've done it all, I can render now, great stuff, job's done, I can leave and go and have a nice cold beer. At this point, the client rings up and says, thanks very much for sending over the render, it all looks great, could we make a couple of changes? What we'd really like is A, B, C, D. So let's add a scenario such as that to this tutorial. So my clients rung me up, they really love it. At the end, however, they'd like some kind of method of transitioning from the end title into the actual program, and they were thinking that maybe a wipe of some kind, and the producer kind of suggested, how about we take the kind of globe object and we use that to kind of create a wipe. And I'm like, okay, yeah, whatever you like, I'll do my best, thanks very much. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to take the globe and we're going to think, right, okay, I think I've finished the scene, but now what I want to do is I've got to take this sphere object that I've created, and here it is, it's this sphere to clone onto, and I need to bring that round in front of my camera. Okay, so let's just have a look at the top view. How am I going to do this? Where's my camera? Oh, it's right back here. So I need to kind of wipe this object so it sort of comes round here in front of the camera. Okay, so probably a good idea at this point is to make yourself a cup of tea. The beer will have to come later, and then you can sit back and plan how you're going to do this, because you don't really want to destroy your scene that you've already built, and if you'd known about this in the beginning, then you'd have possibly built it so that you could do that, but unfortunately life's never that simple, so we have to sort of work around what we have and make the best of it. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I think what I'm just going to do is going to make myself a cup of tea, and then we shall address that situation. Now, we could just take this null here, and we could actually, if we have the move tool selected, we can move this and kind of animate it like so. Slightly cumbersome. There's going to be a few problems with doing that. Now, one of them that immediately you might think of is that we have all these lights set up, and they're set to point at this object. As soon as we pull this over here, then it's not going to be lit by our lights anymore. So that's problem number one. The other thing is that animating it by hand like that might be a little bit tricky. The motion might be a little bit clunky. I mean, I think the best way to do it would be to actually have a sort of null object that it's grouped under, that it could pivot. A bit like the camera setup. If we come down to our camera, if we go up to it, in fact, if we come to the layer browser and let's just unhide it, there's a bit of a gotcha there. If we come to our cam controller here, you can see that the cam controller null is right over here and the camera's here. If we come to our attributes user data and we scrub our heading, you can see that the camera moves around in a nice arc. And I think that if we use a similar setup to that for our sphere, etc., and we pivot it round, we could get it moving in a nice motion in front of our camera here, and it's just really a matter of whereabouts do we put the null object. And I think in a situation like that, it really is going to be a case of trial and error. So the first thing to do is to come to our null sphere, and let's hold Alt down and add a null object. By holding Alt down, as we know, it becomes the parent of the selected object. So let's call this null globe wipe so we know what it's referring to. Switch to our front view. Now what we need to do, actually let's press F5 and switch to quad view so we can see the plan and the camera view at the same time. We don't really need to see the front and right view, we can just work in our top view and our perspective view. Now if we grab this null and move it, as the spheres etc. are all children, they're all going to move with it. But what we want to do is we want to move this null into a position so that when we are rotated around, all these children move. So to move this null object without actually affecting any of its children, we can switch to the Object Axes tool, which is this one here. And with that selected, we can now grab our null and we can move it around. And as you can see, nothing else moves. So that's a pretty good start. I'm just going to undo that. One thing that you may notice is that this null is kind of tilted. So when I grab hold of the X-axis handle and pull it across, it's actually going downwards here. Now I don't really want it to go down, I want it to stay on the same plane as our globe, etc. So if we first of all open our coordinates manager, I have it hidden here, so we can just click. With the Object Axes tool, we can reset the bank first of all. So set that to 0 and click Apply. You'll notice in the perspective view that the null object is now oriented straight, well the y-axis is going straight up. So now if we grab the X handle and pull it across, then it moves on the same plane without actually moving up and down on the y-axis. Okay, so this really is, as I say, a bit of a suck it and see exercise. I'm not sure exactly where this needs to go. So you will need to use a little bit of trial and error here. And the best way to see if this is working is to switch back to your object or your model tool, press R to rotate, and now as we rotate round you can see that our globe is kind of moving around, and if we just stop at this point you can see there it is in front of everything, and you can also see that the lights aren't working, so we just need to remember to address that before we move on. Now it's definitely not near enough here. What we're going to need to do is make it so that the globe actually fills the whole of this screen. At the least it needs to have the kind of top and the bottom poles so that they are outside of this area, and that means we could always use a kind of mask in After Effects and create the wipe that way. So let's hit undo. We know that our null isn't in the right place, and let's try a few values. Let's set this to say 9,000, and now let's see how we get on. Because we've got a sort of slightly bigger radius, it's going to swing nearer. There we go. I mean that's looking a lot more like the result we're after. Let's undo again. I think what we need to do is actually move the null nearer the camera. So I'm going to switch back to my Object Axes tool, and let's just drag this across. Switch back to the model tool, press R to rotate, and now let's slowly move it around and see how we're getting on now. We want it to be quite a nice dynamic swoop, and what you want to be doing is watching over in this window as you do this, so you can see the result that's going to render. So here we go, let's just do that again. It's a bit unfortunate that mine's switching to box view, it's because there's so many objects in the scene, but we can just let go and have a look. Okay, that's looking pretty cool. Yeah, I'm kind of digging that. I think that's going to be okay. Now, I mean, you can always spend a little bit more time on it than I am to get that how you like. So I'm just going to undo. I think there's a couple of undos in there to get it back to the original position. And I think that's great. So now we have our null in the correct position. What we need to do is just set a few rotation keyframes for that, and we should be good to go. As we've already set up our object buffers for both the sphere to clone onto and the sphere with the kind of grid, we can use those as mats to create our wipe. Because I've unfolded my coordinates manager down here, my timeline has become slightly small and possibly a little bit tricky to use like that. So what I'm going to do is just fold this back up. And you may have been wondering how I managed to fold my manager like that, you may know how to do it already, but if in case you don't, what you do is you press the control key and then you left click onto this little part here. And there you go, you can see it folds up and it's actually here, this bar, and when you roll over it, it gives you a little tooltip telling you what's there. So you can do that if you're kind of running out of space. So if you want a bigger object manager, there you go, you see, my attributes and layer browser have been folded down. That's a pretty neat little tip there. Okay, so I'm going to come to 160, I think. And that will give me sort of 15 or 14 frames before the end, and that's probably enough time to perform my wipe, so it's just over half a second. Now with the null globe wipe selected, I need the attributes manager for my coordinates tab. I'm just going to pull this over so I can see the heading a little bit more clearly. There it is. So let's add a key for rotation heading. Now let's jump to the end of the comp, and if we just scrub this value round, okay, probably a good idea to go frame by frame. We want the sphere to actually pass by. There we go. Let's just set it to 45. Okay, and now you can see that we have that nice motion. If we switch to perspective view, drag through, you can see that works just fine. So luckily for us, we've managed to solve our client's request quite quickly. But before we run and hit the render button, we mustn't forget that we also need to solve our lighting problem, because if I move to this point in time here, let's switch back to the perspective view and render, you can see that our lovely blue globe or sphere is now rendering lovely and black. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that our lights move with our globe. Okay, so you might think, well, that's quite simple. What we can do is we can just kind of group them all in the same null that we've just created so that they all rotate together. Let's switch to the layer browser and just unhide our lights, etc. in our managers. And there they all are. So we have our text key light, text fill light, text specular light, and then we have our globe key light, globe backlight, globe fill light. So the only lights that we're worried about here are our globe lights. The text lights can stay where they are because the text that's here doesn't actually move. So let's try that theory out, shall we? So if we just unfold this null globe wipe, let's select our globe fill, back and key light. We also want to select the globe target because this is the target that these lights are pointing at, and we'd like that to move with it as well, otherwise they're all going to kind of keep pointing back here. If we then drag this into our null globe wipe, now let's look at the top view, and if we just scrub through and let's see what's happening. Okay, so all the lights are moving with it, everything looks cool. But one of the problems that you might have noticed is that the lights are actually all rotating. So as we come along here, the lights kind of move over to the right hand side because they're rotating around. So what will happen is this side of the left side of the sphere is not going to be getting any light now. All the light's going to be concentrated on one side. In fact, our fill light here is almost pointing towards the camera, so that means it's kind of illuminating the back of the sphere slightly, so we're not going to get much light from that either. So it doesn't look like that solution is actually the way to move forward. So let's just undo so that everything's back how it was before. So what is an alternative method of solving this? Well, I think the easiest way to do this would just be with a really simple bit of Espresso so that we can link the position of the globe to the position of the lights. Now we don't really want to do that with all our lights because we'd have to offset them, so the simplest way is to set these up as a group and then link that group to the kind of sphere that they're lighting. So let's add in another null object. And let's call this globe lights null. Drag this down. Select our light target and our three lights, and let's drag them into this null object. So nothing's actually changed in the scene. Our globe lights null is already in the correct place. If not, we would have needed to position that before we added these lights to it. Otherwise, when we make the espresso, they're all going to jump to a new position. And now what we can do is we can add an espresso tag to this by choosing tags, Cinema 4D Espresso. Let's drag our globe lights null in. And the object that we want to use the position from is our sphere to clone onto. So let's drag that into here as well. If we click on this little red box here and then choose coordinates global position, what that will do is that will output the global position data of this sphere, and we then need to link it to the global position of our null. So then we choose global position there and they simply join the two up. So what that means is this global lights null will inherit the global position of our sphere to clone onto. It's only going to inherit the position, it's not going to inherit the rotation. So now, if we come here, let's select our globe lights null. In fact, let's select all of our lights so they're kind of, you can see the axes in here. And now as we move forward in time, you can see that the actual position of them changes, but they don't rotate around anymore. So they're still pointing at the front of our sphere. So our illumination lighting won't be affected at all. Cool stuff. So that seems like we've solved that problem. Let's press F1 to switch to our perspective view, fold this up and just deselect. If we now press G, we can nudge through frame by frame and just check that everything's working as it should be. If we render at this point, we should see that the lighting is all working correctly now. Okay, cool, so that looks good. And let's just carry on nudging through frame by frame, make sure everything is okay. Cool stuff. So hopefully this time we'll render and we won't have to make any more changes. So if you've got this far, choose Save Incremental. Once you've saved the project, you can now safely choose Render to Picture Viewer. Okay, I already had the files in there, so I'm just going to choose Yes to overwrite those. Let's expand the picture viewer out so that we can see the whole render. Okay, in these menus at the top we have a few options. You can choose View, and we're not rendering 32-bit, so we can ignore that for now, but you can also adjust the size. You also have the option to show or hide the render line, and this is the white line that will appear shortly. Components, here we can switch between red, green, blue and grayscale. So now we have something rendering, we can actually switch off these particular channels. You can just press RGB to switch them on or off, and then you can choose grayscale. So you have a few different ways of previewing your image. If we come to the channels here, you can see that at the moment we're viewing the image. We can also view our object buffers, or we can view specific render passes. Okay, only the diffuse is relevant at the moment, but if you want to check the different channels, etc., like the alpha channel of your render while it's happening, you can do it all using this menu. So it's probably a good idea to do that just to make sure that everything's looking as it should. So the next thing to do is just to probably go for a walk or something and sit back and wait for the render to come out. And once that's come out, we'll have a look at the results, and we're going to move over to After Effects and bring it all together, add in a few extra elements, and hopefully output the final animation. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the tutorial. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you over in the world of Adobe After Effects. Okay, so what are we doing back? Well, unfortunately for us, the client didn't like it. They wanted to change something else. Isn't life always like that? Never mind. It's a pretty simple change, hopefully. Basically, they were like, oh, okay, we really love it, apart from the beginning. We don't like the fact that you can kind of see some of the world map. It looks a bit messy. Is there any chance that we could have the sphere fully covered, and then as it pulls back, perhaps the world map could kind of appear or something like that? And obviously we accommodate our client's wishes. So we're going to add that small change, and then we're going to render it again. I know, what a pain. But if you've ever worked in a production environment, you probably know that's pretty much how it goes. And normally the client change will occur probably 10 minutes after your render's just finished, and you just waited 2 hours for that render, and then you're like, oh, I've got to do it all again. No worries. That's what we get paid for. We love it really. Okay, so as you can see, I've selected my shade effector globe scale. Enough of this rabbiting. We've been offered a cold beer hours ago and we still haven't got it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use fall off. Simple technique. We've covered this before. So with our globe effector, shader effector even, globe scale selected, let's switch to the fall off tab. Let's choose linear. Okay, and you can see that that's immediately had an effect. At the back of our globe, all the cylinders are present, and at the front we can see our world map. So we need to rotate this. If we rotate it around, okay, let's go the other way. I think we'll wipe from bottom to top. If we hold shift, we'll constrain. And now if we press E to the move tool, we can drag this effector down. I'm going to leave all the settings at default. We could increase the Z depth of our fall off, but I think that we'll just leave it like this for now. Okay, so we've got that at minus 530. We're at frame 0. Let's switch to perspective and have a look. Okay. Hit record. Let's move forward in time. Okay. So as our words come spinning round, by the time they're in place, we want the globe to be visible. So let's go back one frame, say frame 20. If we grab the axes here and we pull our shader effector through the sphere. Okay, let's set it to something like 510. Cool stuff. And let's add another key. If we now scrub back, you can see that as the sphere or the camera pulls back, so our globe texture wipes on. Cool stuff. So now is another good point to save. Let's save incremental. And now we can choose render to picture viewer. Hopefully this time we can render it out and move over to After Effects. No, seriously, next tutorial will be in After Effects. Hopefully you've got this far. Congratulations if you have, and hopefully your render will come out perfect. I'm going to just click yes there to overwrite the previous render. So now is a good time to pat yourself on the back if you have got this far. Go and get yourself a beer or a cup of tea, whatever is your persuasion, and wait for the render to come out, and then I'll see you on the other side in the After Effects part of the tutorial, when we shall take this render and we will be adding in lots of extras. So what we're going to do is we're going to first of all look at the output that's been created from Cinema 4D, and we're going to look at all the passes and the object buffers. We're then going to isolate a few of the elements, add some glows, stuff like that. We're going to add in a background. We're going to be using Trapcode Particular to add in some particle effects, generally enhancing the whole thing, and at the end of that we shall have a completed animation which we will output and then have a little look at. So thanks for watching this tutorial. I've really enjoyed it, and I'll see you over in After Effects. Okay, one last thing before we do actually end this tutorial, which I bet you're thinking is never going to end. It's quite a big heavy scene this, so if you haven't got much RAM in your machine, then you may get out of memory errors. Now I hope that doesn't happen to you. If it does, there are a few options. Buy more RAM. You knew I was going to say that. Okay, another option if you're running release 11 would be to run in 64-bit mode. Okay, and if you're using pre-release 11 and you're on a PC in Windows, then you can use a 64-bit version there. So with Windows, the 64-bit version, I believe, is a separate executable. But with the Mac version, what you can do is you find the application on your hard drive, find the application icon, and then you can choose File Get Info or press Command I, and that will bring up the Get Info box for you. The Get Info dialog box looks like this, and if you notice here, we have an option here which should probably be checked, Open in 32-bit mode. If that is checked, uncheck it, and then Cinema 4D will work in 64-bit mode. If you're using pre-release 11 and you are on a Mac and you do get any memory problems, then you're going to have to kind of come back to the scene and make a few adjustments to see if you can render it. I mean, hopefully you will have enough RAM and you won't get any memory problems, but I just thought I'd address this just in case you do. And probably the easiest way to solve this would be to reduce the number of polygons in the scene, and perhaps the biggest hog of polygons is the object that you can see in front of you now, which is the cloner object with all the cylinders. So imagine if we'd have left the cylinders as they originally defaulted to, with kind of 36 rotation segments and 8 height segments, etc. I mean, I think pretty much most people would run out of memory. So if you do have memory problems, one of the first things that you should perhaps try is to reduce the number of clones on this object, and the way that you do that is to select the sphere that they're cloned onto, and if you go into the attribute manager for that object, what you can do is you can reduce down the number of segments. I think it's something really high, like 384. So I mean, first of all, just half that. You won't have quite the same resolution of your world map and your soccer ball, etc. So you might want to just scale up the diameter of the cylinders to compensate, but you should still get a very, very similar result. Anyway, all that aside, mine's rendering fine, so hopefully yours will be too. But if you do ever have any render problems due to memory in any of your scenes, then first thing I would do is switch to 64-bit mode if it's available to you. If not, then you need to perhaps reduce the resolution of any textures that you're using and reduce the polygon count as much as possible. Anyway, happy rendering and see you in After Effects.